The look of Moscow in 1995, but sounds from more than 40 years before, when this was a very different city, when it was the capital of the Soviet Union. Much was recorded in more than 70 Soviet years. Private telephone conversations, public meetings, police interrogations, and music. All these things were recorded and stored. In 1992, an American television producer, Tristan Dell, was in Moscow looking for background music for a film.
And the next thing I knew, they took me to some God-forgotten industrial building in the outskirts of Moscow. And we started to go through floors upon floors upon floors of boxes. And that was the beginning of the Odyssey.
What Dell had stumbled across was a musical treasure trove, the archives of Soviet broadcasting. Here were the records of nearly 70 years of music making. They were intended to demonstrate the supremacy of the Soviet artist and the grandeur of Soviet culture. On these dusty shelves lay a vast and jumbled mass of audio tape, video, and film, the moving image of a musical age, unknown and protected from the outside world. Among these thousands of recordings are concerts by some of the greatest musical talents of our century. As well as the modern energy of Shostakovich's piano concerto, the archive also contains quite different material, recalling older, archetypal images of Russia. The work of the Ukrainian film director, Alexander Dovchenko, is steeped in myth and folk tradition. In his last film, Poem About the Sea, he used one of the Soviet Union's greatest singers, the tenor Ivan Kozlovsky, as a bard whose music conjures up timelessness and continuity, values that the Soviet authorities wanted their people to revere. From the very beginning of the Soviet Union, musicians were sent out to its most remote corners, to distant cities, factories, villages, and farms, to take music to the people. Another great tenor, Sergei Lemeshev, sings about the joys of Soviet life to a group of factory workers. A star of the pre-war Bolshoi stage, Valeria Barsova, brings the canary acrobatics of bel canto to a group of coal miners.
Oh, my baby, my curly-headed baby, just tuck your head like little bird beneath its mother's wing.
As well as recordings by Soviet artists, there are others by foreign visitors, sympathizers with the regime. Sometimes these musicians had been in trouble in their own country. Robeson's political beliefs and his black skin had led to harassment in America. In the Soviet Union, he was a hero. Most of the tapes and films in this archive record performances by great masters of classical music. Such music was immensely popular in the Soviet Union. The rich traditions of 19th century concert-going had flourished and grown. The Tchaikovsky Hall of the Moscow Conservatory was the mecca of Soviet music lovers.
Уникальный квартет. Давид Ойстрах и Леонид Коган с сыновьями Игорем и Павлом. Концерт Вивальди для 4 скрипок с оркестром.
And on this same stage, one of the pianists most familiar to Western audiences, Sviatoslav Richter. What these archival records have caught are episodes from a living tradition of listening, a tradition which has upheld the values and strengths of yesterday's great masters. Even in the homes of the most admired teachers of our own day, you can find collections of portraits, photographs, and documents. They're like a wall of icons, celebrating and communicating the history of Russian music making.
Я думаю, что вот эта традиция действительно определила портрет, может быть, портрет пианистического искусства 20-го столетия. Она создала как бы этот портрет, так я думаю. Потому что действительно, если мы возьмем начало века и его конец, то тут вот сформировались все замечательные исполнители и педагоги, которые потом учили других, так сказать, пианистов уже не только в России, но в разных странах мира.
Among these films are recordings not only of intimate occasions, but of grand public displays for which the country was and is famous. Like the Bolshoi Theatre, with its spectacular and sometimes spectacularly vulgar productions of patriotic operas.
Bolshoi Theatre was a glory, but the Bolshoi Theatre was the Soviet system's domain. An amount of money they pump into it was unlimited. Producers could afford to rehearse an opera for a year and a half. Costumes and the material for costumes, the real thing on stage, the props, the amount of money you spend are relevant and immaterial.
The Bolshoi Theatre was a miniature version of the whole Soviet Union, a heavily bureaucratic, heavily controlled institution based on collective labor. But with stars, great stars, like Ivan Kozlovsky.
They were, in a way, rivals, Kozlovsky and Lemeshev, like Pavarotti and Domingo now. But unlike Pavarotti and Domingo, who were sharing the world, Lemeshev and Kozlovsky were sharing the same stage, appearing in the same roles, had to serve in the same institution. But yet, they managed to create a very friendly relationship between them. And I have to tell you that the country was totally bewitched by both of them. And I am not mistaken if I say, I am not exaggerating if I say, that the country was virtually divided into two camps.
Flowers, adulation, wild applause are the stock in trade of opera houses the world over, including the Bolshoi. But there was something more than star worship in the welcome home for a great musical legend, the composer Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky had left Russia well before 1917. He was officially anti-Soviet, but in 1962 he was persuaded to make a brief return. For Russians, the visit was a revelation, a symbol of hope and a source of many anecdotes.
Тут пока, значит, врач туда-сюда, приходит врач, он так из фрака, из какого-то карманчика достает в какую-то такую бутылочку маленькую и делает глоток. Врач говорит: Игорь Федорович, что вы пили? Он говорит: это коньяк. Он говорит: как? Вам же нельзя, это же сейчас. Почему? Это расширяет сосуды. Он говорит: ну потом сужает, а потом я опять. Он говорит, и улыбнулся, встал, одел фрак и пошел дирижировать второе отделение. Но и концерт прошел с бешеным успехом.
In recent years, another well-known musical exile has begun going back to his native Russia. Vladimir Ashkenazy left the Soviet Union in 1964, near the beginning of his career. He's back working with the St. Petersburg Philharmonic. He's critical of the old regime, but enthusiastically loyal to the traditions of Russian music making, both in performance and in education.
When I think of my life in Russia, my most wonderful memories are from my school years and conservatory years. Because I was learning music, everything was opening to me as a child, as a teenager. You lived for the music, you were with the music, and it was absolutely wonderful. I don't know if I would have had it anywhere else, but you can't live your life twice, of course. That was absolutely tremendous, and I'll never regret those years. It's when you become an adult in the Soviet Union, that's where problems begin, because you suddenly realize what is around you.
The long, hard, careful, and detailed structure of Soviet musical training was a paradox. On the one hand, it could lead to great mastery and professionalism. On the other, it was itself part of a far wider, more elaborate web of control.
The phenomenon of the informer, I think somebody should write a book about that, because the Russians did very well on that. Of course, it has a long history because it goes back way into the Tsarist times. However, obviously the informer and the people who wrote anonymous letters and things like that came into their own in the Stalinist period.
You see what they do? They take a rather young student, inexperienced in life, to a very dark room in the conservatory, face to face with KGB a representative there. Nobody else, so it's just two people. So you have no support of any kind, and they say, well, you know that our organs, as they say, organi, we work for the people, we work for the security of our great socialist motherland, and we believe you as a true Komsomolets, which was a young communist league. I had to be a member, almost 99% were members. I'm sure you would like to help us. I said, how? Well, we have some foreign students in the conservatory. We're not sure about why they're here, or we might need some information about them. I'm sure you won't mind supplying us some information we need. Of course, you are terrified to say no, because you think, well, if you say no now, you might forget as well about your future life. So you say, yes, okay. You sign and you say, yes, I do that. Then, of course, you reflect and think, how could I possibly report on my fellow students? Of course, I couldn't, and I never did. So they take you to hotels, usually. They have special rooms there. And they ask, you know this student? I said, well, I met her or him a few times. What do you know about? Well, I write, well, I don't know much about this student, really. Do you remember what he said? Well, I said, I don't really remember what he said. Do you know what his or her parents are? I can't remember, but I think when I met this person 5 years ago somewhere else, maybe he said one of his parents was a dentist or something like that. So you write something just to get rid of it. And I never supplied any information altogether, basically. That's all you can do. So what you do with the authorities, you say, oh yes, I'm doing everything for you. In fact, you do your best not to do anything, in fact. So they fired me very soon after that, because they couldn't get anything out of me.
If you were a student who wanted to take part in an international competition, you had to have a character reference from the Komsomol. You had to, they had to know that you've been studying all your political subjects at the Conservatoire well, and that you weren't going to run away or abscond or say stupid things in the press, whatever it was, about the Soviet Union, or tell stories which might show them up in a bad light, or say that there were no lemons in the shop. I don't know, even at a banal level like that, they were very sensitive.
From its very beginning, the International Tchaikovsky Competition had been established as the finest piano competition in the world. So the second competition was seen as an important and highly political event. On stage together at the closing ceremony, some of the most renowned and some of the more dubious figures in Soviet musical life. The pianist Lev Oborin, the cellist Shostakovich, the violinist David Oistrakh, Tikhon Khrennikov, head of the Composers' Union, Ekaterina Furtseva, the Minister of Culture, the pianist Emil Gilels. One of the stars of the second competition was the British pianist John Ogden, until then almost completely unknown.
Those who organized the first Tchaikovsky competition felt that it is difficult for them to acknowledge that the first winner of the piano competition was an American, with Russian music, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, etc., etc. I think the party took it quite well, and even the great Khrushchev said, well, if he was the best, he's the best, fine. But the other people lower on the ladder, they thought that the next competition must have a Russian pianist who would win.
Правильно. Политическое давление было всегда в российских конкурсах. Всегда.
Чайковский. Первый концерт, вторая и третья части. Исполняет Владимир Ашкенази, Советский Союз.
The victory of the American Van Cliburn at the first competition had created a problem. After all, Soviet audiences heard every day that their musicians were the best. National pride was at stake.
So they decided to gather all possible candidates, all those who were better at that time. That's why I fell into the basket, you see. The problem was that I, by that time, got married to a foreigner, which was an arch-crime, of course, in Russia. And they said, well, if you don't participate in the competition, you might as well forget about your career forever. And in the end, I shared the prize with John Ogden. But at least there was a Russian prize in the first prize, so they were happy with that. And I got my career back. But I was well known before, too, so I didn't really need it for any reason. And the Tchaikovsky piano concerto was not my piece.
И тут всегда, в общем, встаешь в тупик. С одной стороны, нельзя не признать, что конкурс, как такого рода спортивное состязание, в общем, стоит вне границ искусства. Это противоестественно для искусства. Как выработать оценку? Если в спорте у вас есть конкретные данные, то есть скорость для бегуна, вес для тяжеловеса, который поднимает гири и так далее. Конкретно это определяется долями секунды аппаратурой. То в музыкальном конкурсе это определить невозможно таким путем. Следовательно, критерии любого музыкального конкурса зависят от суммы вкусов членов жюри. И это было бы еще хорошо, если бы этому не было бы сопровождаемо целым рядом побочных обстоятельств, вообще никакого отношения не имеющих к искусству. Если встать на точку зрения, чтобы понять эмоциональное ощущение участника конкурса, это, конечно, чудовищно.
Well, totalitarian state with a dictator who only died in 1953, Stalin, everything was subject to one line of thought. What that line of thought was sometimes would be impossible even to articulate or formulate. It was a fear of doing something wrong, basically, from the lower steps in the hierarchy of the party apparatus or whatever. The whole country was a hierarchical society. So that meant that if there is anything, that anything could be perceived as an individual expression or an expression that throws some shadow on our glorious achievements of the socialist state, then a very low hack, party hack or whatever, even without a party ticket, would say, oh, we can't do that, you know, I'm afraid, this must be, let me ask somebody else. So it would always go to the top of the party. And they would be also afraid to do something wrong because they might be dismissed or sent to a camp or whatever it is. So that is basically the situation. It's not an exaggeration. And that, at that point, touched every aspect of life, including music.
The Soviet triumph was hollow. Soon, Ashkenazi had left the country. He was branded a traitor.
If they had any vision of the world, which they never had, they would see, if a Russian artist, say if Gilles or Richter decided to leave at that time, they would still be a Russian artist who lives abroad, who represents Russian school, Soviet Union, whatever it is, right? But they couldn't see it that way. They could only see that, oh, one of our important artists is leaving our country, and our system is degraded by that particular act. That's all they saw. It's totally political. There's nothing else about it.
Hidden among the riches of these archives are many tapes and films of one particular artist who dared to confront the Soviet system head-on, one of the greatest performing musicians of our time, the cellist Mstislav Rostropovich.
Oh, Rostropovich is a great cellist for many reasons. I mean, he is just a fantastic master of the instrument to start with. There's nothing he can't do. He has a fantastic gift for communication, I would say. When he comes onto the stage, there's a kind of lift in the hall, you can feel it. He also championed so many new works, and he extended the cello repertory immensely. He extended the possibilities of the cello, the technical possibilities of the cello, and he, being an enthusiast about these things, he also communicated, and for instance, to people who studied with him, it became a kind of a necessity for him that his students also studied new repertoire and continued the kind of work that he was doing in that way. He thought that was very important.
Rostropovich giving a public masterclass at the Moscow Conservatory in 1967. And from the same archive, a tribute from one of his closest friends, the composer Shostakovich.
Одно из самых моих ярких впечатлений – это знакомство и дружба с замечательным музыкантом Мстиславом Леопольдовичем Ростроповичем. Ростропович в совершенстве владеет искусством игры на виолончели. Он обладает феноменальной техникой, но никогда эта техника не бывает у него самоцелью. Техника ему служит для передачи музыкального содержания исполняемых им произведений. Лично для меня творческое общение с Мстиславом Ростроповичем было всегда огромной радостью. И уже ни с чем не сравнимой радостью для меня это было исполнение им моих сочинений.
This performance was filmed in 1966, but within a few years, Rostropovich, despite his international fame, was on a collision course with Soviet authority. His crime was to have publicly defended the writer Solzhenitsyn, and to have even offered him shelter in his home.
Russia has a long tradition, a 200-year-old tradition, of the artist playing a role in society that is much more prominent than that of any artist in the West, and much more political. And I think the reason, in the first place, is pretty obvious, really. It's a society where there has never been free speech, a society where there was never any participation by ordinary people, or even really by many educated people, in the political process. And because of that, because of the fact there was no opposition, and the church, for a long while, did not provide a real opposition either, which I know it did in some countries, artists took it upon themselves to be if you like, the moral voice, the moral conscience of the society.
Here's part of a letter Rostropovich wrote to the newspaper Pravda in October 1970. Has time really not taught us to approach cautiously the crushing of talented people, and not to speak in the name of all the people, not to oblige the people to express as their own opinions what they have not even read or heard? I recall with pride that I didn't go to the meeting in the Central House of Cultural Workers when Boris Pasternak was abused, and where I was expected to deliver a speech which I had been commissioned to deliver, criticizing Dr. Zhivago, which at the time I had not even read. But explain to me, please, why in our literature and art so often people absolutely incompetent in this field have the final word. Why are they given the right to discredit our art in the eyes of our people? I recall the past not in order to grumble, but in order that in future, let's say 20 years, we won't have to bury today's newspapers in shame. Every man must have the right fearlessly to think independently and express his opinion about what he knows, what he has personally thought about and experienced, and not merely to express with slightly different variations the opinion which has been inculcated in him. I know that after my letter there'll undoubtedly be an opinion about me, but I'm not afraid of it. I openly say what I think.
That was, I think, in 1970. And then from gradually, they just eased him out of as many playing jobs as possible, starting with the Bolshoi Theatre, where he was conducting. I think that was the first thing. And then they didn't allow him to travel abroad. They didn't allow him to meet BBC film crew. They didn't allow him to do this. They didn't allow him to do that. They didn't allow him to record. And gradually they were narrowing down his field of action completely. And it also affected his family, his wife, although she continued singing in the Bolshoi because she was a principal soprano, until he decided to ask for permission to go away on a 2-year sabbatical in order. I think he was terribly demoralized. I don't think any other artist had that treatment, or certainly no other artist of his stature, but on the other hand, no other artist had made a public protest.
This studio recording was made in 1974, 4 years after that letter was written. The conductor is the composer of the piece, Aram Khachaturian. By this time, Rostropovich's difficulties with the authorities were so grave that he was faced with a tough decision about his future.
You start perhaps to lose faith in yourself, and people forever telling you you're not allowed to play for the Soviet people, which is, of course, it's ridiculous on one side, and everyone could see it's ridiculous. On the other hand, it is very demoralizing, and I would say very depressing, and no doubt it did affect him. That's why he wanted to leave. I think that Vishnevskaya saw that very easily from the outside, and she thought he had to go because he was being destroyed by this. I think she thought that really he must go and discover his own worth again. I mean, it sounds silly to say that a man like that could have doubts about himself, but I remember when he came out to the West, you know, he seemed kind of quite surprised that everybody wanted to listen to him.
Rostropovich was cast out by the Soviet authorities, although there are those who now choose to remember the episode in a more mellow light.
Я с Ростроповичем дружил. И, ну, конечно, я не мог радоваться его отъезду, потому что это виолончелист изумительный. Вот. Так что я не способствовал его отъезду, и в этом, так сказать, я не замешан, как говорится. Я старался вообще в политические дела не вмешиваться, потому что я занимался музыкой. Это, так сказать, уже была не моя сфера. И я не мог симпатизировать этому отъезду, наоборот, я был очень расстроен.
The political and musical consequences were felt even in the archives, but occasionally an archivist could flout the system.
Что касается вот этой истории с архивом и заменой названий фильма, заменой фамилий, то я думаю, что это нужно отдать честь и должную благодарность отдельным работникам архива, которые, рискуя в достаточной степени, заменяли эти названия, понимая, что их нельзя не сохранить. И честь им и хвала.
Когда выехали такие известные наши исполнители, как Ростропович, Галина Вишневская, была команда стереть их материалы. Однако, мы, как работники архива, естественно, не могли такого допустить и знали, что когда-то это является все-таки национальным достоянием. Этот культурный слой, он должен быть сохранен. И поэтому работники архива, невзирая на такие команды, старались каким-то образом убрать этот материал. Допустим, менялись этикетки на этих материалах, стирались фамилии, убирались какие-то отдаленные части хранилищ, но материал этот был сохранен. Я думаю, что это, будем говорить, подвиг работников архива. Они, в общем-то, такие должны быть работники архива. Они не должны, так сказать, поддаваться каким-то политическим сегодня нюансам, каким-то течениям. Иначе тогда погибнет вся культура, погибнет культурный слой.
Мои записи, которые я делал в системе Госкомитета по радио и телевидению, были просто-напросто уничтожены. Не из-за меня, а из-за еврейских музыкантов, которые эмигрировали из Большого симфонического оркестра радио, которым я руководил, и было дано указание вырезать этих музыкантов, даже если они видны со спины. В фильмах. Они не понимали того, что когда вырезали одного еврея, то с ним вместе с одним евреем вырезалось еще 16 тактов музыки. Издержки времени. И отношение к искусству. Люди, которые поменяли название, я повторяю, рисковали очень многим. А те, которые вырезали евреев, ничем не рисковали. Они рискуют только сейчас, потерявши свое человеческое лицо, оставшись неизвестными. Да.
What heroic and anonymous archivists had saved was a nation's treasure, created by great musicians at the peak of their form.
не верится, что все это было.